Inside the application, I want to add another action button here that a user can click on to edit a movie. So let's go into the list template that displays these movies. And what I can do is copy some existing markup. So I will copy this button that allows the user to go to the details and paste it in and just change around a few parameters. Instead of going to the details route, we want to go to the edit route. That's a route that is not yet defined, but we'll do that next. And I can imagine if I'm going to edit a movie, I'll still need the ID of a movie. So I will leave that expression in place. And I've changed the text to say edit. So let me save list.html and let's come into our app. And what I want is another route. This one can be edit / and an ID parameter. And the module to load will be movies / edit. And I just want to point out that I could have multiple routes point to the same module. So maybe I also wanted a route later that will allow a user to create a brand new movie. Maybe I'll want to see create in the URL. I can do that and have it point to the same module, movie / edit. That view model can figure out if it's trying to edit an existing movie or create a new movie just by looking for the presence of an ID parameter. If it's not there, we're trying to create a movie. But let me add in the required comma here. We're going to save this file. And now I can focus on the edit functionality. So in my movies folder, let me add a JavaScript file. This will be edit.js. And of course, we will need the view. So I will also add an HTML page. This will be edit.html. And once again, let's start with the HTML. So I need my template element. And I'll need a div with the class of container. And let's use some Bootstrap styling to try to make this form look somewhat reasonable. So let's create a div that has a class of panel default. And inside of here will be a div with a panel title. And it's inside of here where I might have a header element that says something like editing. And let's try to put the title of the movie into the header. And I will actually need this title to be inside of a div panel heading. Then after the heading would come the panel body. And it's inside the panel body where I will want my form. So we can make this a horizontal form. And let's create some basic input. So a div with a class of form group, which is, again, a lot of Bootstrap styles being applied here to make the form look somewhat decent. What I want to do is create a form group for the label and the input for the movie title. So a label with a class of column small 2 and control label. This will be for the title of the movie. And then a div with a class of column small 10 to take up the remaining 10 units. And that will contain my input. It will be a type text input. Let's say that the placeholder for this will be title. So we know we're entering the movie title if it is blank. I want it to have a class of form control. And I want to bind the value to movie.title. So before we worry about actually saving the movie and performing validation, let's at least see if we can get the data on the screen. So I'll need another div, a form group, again with a label that is restricted to column small 2. This will be for the release year. And after the release year, a div, column small 10, with an input that has a class of form control. Let's also start off this type as text and have a placeholder value and bind the value to movie.releaseYear. And now let's see if we can get the view model to put some data on the screen. I will export a class called edit, and this class will need the movie data component so it can retrieve and then save a movie. So let's again import the inject attribute from Aurelia framework and import movie data from the local movie data module. And I'll add the annotation, which will add the metadata so we can properly inject movie data and save that off into a field of the class. So again, I don't want to fetch the movie in the constructor. I want to fetch the movie from the activate method because then I can return a promise and let the router know when I have retrieved my initial data. Activate does get a parameters object And it's here where I could look and see if parameters has an ID property or not. But let's just take the simple case where we're just going to edit existing movies. So I'll say this.data, let's get by ID, using the ID that was passed into me. And then that should return a movie to me. So I'll say this.movie equals that incoming movie. And of course, I want to return this promise. Let's save everything and refresh and see how this turned out. I'll go to Edit Star Wars, and it looks like I have a little bit of trouble with my markup, but we are getting the proper data onto the screen, and if I edit Star Wars, I can see that I have two-way data binding between this input and the title of the movie, which is in my view model, and because there's also an interpolation expression up here that looks at that title, I can see the updates in real time. So with this in place, we can fix up the UI a little bit, and then add our save button to actually persist the changes that we make. Let's return to our view, and it would appear that I'm not using the correct Bootstrap class here. I need to have a dash here. This is column small 2. That controls the width of the label. And now that I have the proper class, title should move over here to the left side of the form. And now I need to add a button to this form. A button with a class of button, button primary. This button will just have the text save. And I want to wire up the click event to invoke some behavior inside of my view model, and there's really two ways to do that. One is to use trigger and say, please invoke the save method for me. And the other approach is to use click.delegate. The difference between the two is that both will wire up a click event handler on this element, but with delegate, I can also catch click events from any of this element's descendants. And that can be an advantage when this element has a lot of children or a lot of grandchildren, and you want to listen for click events on those children, but you don't necessarily want to waste the time and memory required to wire up a click event on each individual descendant. Instead, this is providing a click event handler at the parent level. There's just one, and it will catch all the click events from anything inside. Aurelia will even let you pass in an argument here, $event, that will pass in the native event object into my viewModel method, and then inside of that method I could decide what I want to do in response to that click. For this scenario, we don't need anything quite so fancy. I can just invoke save, and I can safely just use trigger here, because I really don't have any child elements. But I also don't have that save method implemented inside of my viewModel, so let's implement this. I need a save method, and I would expect to just be able to turn around to my movie data component and tell it to save this movie that I'm holding on to. And then I need to figure out what to do next. I need to tell the user somehow that this movie was saved successfully. And perhaps one way to do that would be to redirect to the details page for this particular movie. There's a number of different ways to do that, but one way to do that is to use the router. So I am going to import the router from Aurelia router so that I can inject the router into my constructor, or at least some component that looks like the router, and then I can save that router off as a field so I can have access to the router later and use it to navigate. Notice I'm not going to use configure router. I'm not trying to create a new router instance. In this case, if I were to add a configure router method to this view model, I would be creating a new child router, which can be useful in master detail type scenarios when you want nested routing or hierarchical routing. I'm just taking the existing router, injecting it into my constructor, and now I have the ability to use that router to programmatically navigate throughout the application. So inside of my promise handler for saving the movie, I would expect save to give me an updated movie, just in case the server applied some sort of logic to the movie. And it's inside of here where I can let the router compute the URL for the details page that I want to get to. I can say this.router, please generate a URL for the details route. And just like with route-href, that custom attribute where I had to pass in an object that gives it the parameters to generate the route, I need to pass in an object that has an ID field so that the router can figure out what ID parameter to plug into the URL. So URL equals router.generate the details route, and then with the router I can navigate to some URL in the application. And this is all I need my viewModel save method to do for now. I currently don't have a save method in my movie data component, so we will need to add this piece also. I would expect you to pass the movie to save into this method. And now saving the movie could simply be return this.http_client.put. I want to update a movie, so that's going to be an HTTP put operation. Do a put to the base URL and send along the movie. Now, if you don't have a true server-side API, you're just using a JSON file, what you might do here is just use console.log to see something come by in the developer window that lets you know that you saved a movie correctly. But in my demo, I actually want to call my real server-side API and do an http.put and put the movie there. And one day it should be just this easy with Aurelia. But there is a slight hiccup in the framework currently at the time of this recording, and that is Aurelia currently does not send along the proper HTTP request header when it has taken an object and serialized it into JSON. It should send along a request header that says the content type of this request is application/JSON, and that's currently not there. So I'm going to need to write a little more code to work around that problem, but this will also demonstrate how to have some more flexibility with HTTP client. What I'm going to do is create an HTTP request object from the HTTP client by telling it to create a request. And what I'm really getting back is an instance of a request builder. It's an object that has methods that allow me to configure this particular request. For instance, a method as put, which will tell the request to send along an HTTP put message. I'm also going to say with the URL of my base URL, I'm going to explicitly give it a header that says I accept anything that is application/JSON. And I'll send another header that says I'm going to send you content of type application/JSON. And finally, here is my content, which is the movie. And now, instead of returning a promise from HTTP client.put, I'm going to return request.send. That will send the HTTP request, and then I can process the response and just return response.content, which will be the updated movie. So now you can see a bit of the configuration API around HTTP client, and you can also use something very similar on an HTTP client instance itself to configure it globally for an application. So if you have some sort of header that is an authorization header, you always want that authorization header in the request. You can do that during application startup time. But with this new code in place, let's save everything, refresh the application, and I can see that my form layout is better. And you might know that the reason I want to edit Star Wars is because it was actually released in 1977, the original. So let's save this. That brings me back to the details view, and now I can go back to the list, and we have successfully saved that movie into the database.